Inside the outer wall of the largest religious building on Earth, a few hundred meters past where the tour groups stop, there is a low mound in the grass, a meter high, unremarkable. For more than a century, nobody put a trench through it, because everybody knew what happened here. In the year 1431, an army came from the west, the city fell, and the jungle closed over it. Then a team from the Greater Angkor project put a trench through it anyway. What came out of that trench, and out of the mud at the bottom of the moat, 400 meters away, does not describe an ending. The radiocarbon dates from this ground disagree with every textbook date for the fall of Angkor. They disagree in the direction nobody expected, and the reason that matters is not what was found. It is what was still there afterwards. Start with what the ground actually looks like, because almost nobody has seen it properly. In 2012, a survey aircraft flew a grid over the forest north of the temple, carrying a laser scanner, firing pulses down through the canopy, and timing the returns. Damian Evans and his colleagues published the result the following year. Strip the trees away digitally, and what appears underneath is not a temple complex surrounded by jungle. It is a city. Streets, embankments, house plots, reservoirs, a grid running out for kilometers in every direction, covering something on the order of 1,000 square kilometers. The largest low-density urban settlement anywhere in the pre-industrial world. And a low mound in the grass inside the enclosure wall appears on those maps as clearly as everything else. It had been sitting there in the data for years. Nobody dug it, because the question it might have answered was considered closed. Here is the version that closed it. Around 1113, Surya Varman II takes the throne and begins the temple, dedicating it to Vishnu, and it takes most of his reign to build. In 1177, a Cham fleet comes up the river system and takes the capital. Jayavarman VII drives them out, rebuilds at Angkor Thom, and puts up more than 100 rest houses and hospitals across the empire. Then the record thins. Building stops. The inscriptions stop. And in 1431, an Ayutthayan army comes from the west, the capital falls, the court leaves, and the forest takes what remains. That sequence is in every encyclopedia entry ever written on the subject. It is clean, it has a date, and it has a villain. It also has a problem, and the problem is that when a capital city is sacked and abandoned, it leaves a specific signature in the ground. Burning, collapse, a layer of destruction that separates the occupied levels below from the empty ones above. Archaeologists have gone looking for that horizon at Angkor for decades. It is not there. There is no destruction layer for 1431. Hold that, because it does not yet mean what it sounds like it means, and the obvious explanation is wrong. What it does mean is that the date at the center of the story is being asked to carry weight the evidence does not put on it. Every account of the fall of Angkor is organized around a year that the excavated ground does not register. And that ought to be the end of the matter, except that something did happen here. The court did leave. The building programs did stop. The most complex settlement in the world at that time did stop functioning as what it had been, and the forest did close over large parts of it. Those things are real, and they need explaining. To explain them, you have to abandon the assumption underneath the whole question, which is that Angkor was a city in the way you are picturing a city. It was not. It was something much stranger, much larger, and considerably more fragile than a capital with walls and a palace and a garrison. What sustained roughly 750,000 people on that plain was not the temples, and it was not the army. It was the water. And the arrangement that moved it had a flaw built into it from the beginning, which nobody noticed for 400 years, because for 400 years the weather cooperated. The berets are the place to start, because they are the largest things anybody on that plain ever built, and almost nobody talks about them. The West Beret is a rectangular reservoir roughly 8 kilometers long and 2 across, dug and embanked by hand. There is another to the east, and beyond those a system of feeder canals, distribution channels, embankments, sluices, spillways, and moats running out across the whole settlement, taking water off the Siem Reap and the Puak, moving it, holding it, and letting it go again again on a schedule. This is usually presented as engineering genius, and it was. Read it the other way, and it tells you something less comfortable. A settlement of that size, spread that thin on that soil, in a monsoon climate that delivers most of a year's rain in 4 months and almost none in the rest, cannot exist without the machine running. Not comfortably. At all. What kept 750,000 people fed on that plain was not the temples, and it was not the army. It was the ditches. Sarah Klassen, Damian Evans, and colleagues modeled the population from the settlement data and put Greater Angkor somewhere in the region of 700 to 900,000 people. The exact figure is argued over. The order of magnitude is not. So the empire's foundation was a water network it had to keep clearing season after season, or the whole arrangement stopped paying out. That is not a golden age. That is a standing obligation. Now the flaw in it, which is the opposite of the one you are expecting. The obvious threat to a system like that is drought, and drought is what most people assume finished Angkor. It did not. A hydraulic city can survive a dry year, and it can survive several, because that is exactly what the reservoirs are for. Holding water through a shortfall is the entire point of the design. What the design could not survive was water arriving too fast. And the reason has nothing to do with climate. Look at how the network was actually built. Nobody sat down and engineered it. It was accreted piece by piece across 4 centuries by a succession of kings with different priorities, different capitals, and different favored quarters of the plain. Jayavarman II moves the seat north. His successors extend westward. Suryavarman puts his temple and its moat where he wants it. Jayavarman VII builds Angkor Thom and cuts new channels to serve it. Each addition was rational on its own. The sum of them was a single interlocking hydraulic system that no one had ever designed, no one held a plan for, and no one had ever stress-tested end to end. An accreted network has no margin. Every junction, every spillway, every embankment is sized for the flows somebody assumed at the moment it was dug, and those assumptions were made independently, decades apart, by people who could not know what would be added upstream after they died. Push a volume through it that exceeds what any one component was built to pass, and the failure does not stay local. It travels. That is a vulnerability written into the thing from the beginning. For 400 years it never mattered, because for 400 years the monsoon behaved. And the record shows the strain arriving long before any army does. The channels start telling on themselves. But nobody at Angkor wrote it down, because the people who could see it were not the people who kept the inscriptions. Now look at what this empire had already survived, because the list is longer than the story admits. In 1177, a Cham fleet came up the Mekong, crossed the Tonle Sap, went up a tributary river, and took the capital by surprise. Not a border raid. The capital. The seat of the empire, occupied by a foreign navy. And it did not end there. Jayavarman VII pulled the squabbling factions back together, drove the Cham out, counterattacked, and made Champa a vassal for a time. What followed was the most productive stretch in the empire's history. New capital works at Angkor Thom, more than 100 rest houses and hospitals built for common people across the territory. A capital had fallen to an invading fleet, and the empire's response was a building boom. Set that beside the rest of the record. Suryavarman II invaded Dai Viet repeatedly and failed repeatedly. He turned on Champa instead, killed the Cham king, sacked the capital, installed his own brother-in-law on the throne, and went home to celebrate. The Cham rebelled immediately and executed the brother-in-law. He invaded again, and it is believed he died on that campaign. Across 3 centuries, the same pattern holds. Champa usually won when the Khmer invaded. The Khmer usually won when Champa invaded. Cities were plundered, loot was carried off, victories were declared, and almost no territory changed hands. Then there is what was happening inside. From its earliest years as an empire, the state was ridden with palace intrigue, civil war, and internal rebellion, and a great many of those rebellions succeeded. The nobility fought each other for the throne while the ministers, scholars, and priestly bureaucracy actually ran the country, and the practical effect was that their power and wealth increased steadily for centuries. In 1292, the Mongols arrived on the frontier. There were border clashes. The Khmer gave them gold and they went away, which brings the whole military explanation into focus, and it does not survive contact with its own evidence. This empire had been sacked by a foreign navy, torn by generations of civil war, invaded by the Cham, threatened by the Mongols, and abandoned by its western vassals, and it did not collapse once in 600 years. It absorbed all of it. The Ayutthaya campaign of 1431 is being asked to explain an ending that 400 years of comparable events conspicuously failed to produce. When the same cause fails a dozen times and succeeds once, the honest reading is not that the cause finally worked. It is that something else had changed in between. And something had. Look at what the empire stops doing. The building programs cease. The great inscriptions, which had run continuously for 4 centuries, thin out and then stop entirely. There are no surviving historical records from the last century of Angkor's existence. Whatever was happening on that plain in the 1300s, the people it happened to left almost nothing written about it. So the written record goes dark exactly where the answer sits, which is the reason this question stayed open for as long as it did. Every account of the fall is an argument about a silence, unless you can find something that recorded those years without being asked to. Something that was alive at the time, that kept a measurement of every single season, that had no stake in the outcome and no reason to lie about it, and that is still standing. There is. It is not in Cambodia. It is 700 kilometers away, in the mountains of Vietnam, and it had never heard of Angkor. The trees are called Phokienia hojinsi, a cypress that grows on the slopes of Bidup Nui Ba in the Vietnamese highlands, and the useful thing about them is that they can live for the better part of 1,000 years. Every year, each one lays down a ring. In a wet monsoon, the ring is wide. In a failed monsoon, it is narrow. Nobody records it, nobody edits it, and the tree has no opinion about what the numbers mean. It simply keeps count and goes on standing there. Brendan Buckley and his colleagues cored those trees and published the sequence in 2010. What it shows for the 14th and 15th centuries is not a gradual drying. It is 2 prolonged, severe droughts, one running through the middle and later 1300s, a second in the early 1400s, and between them and around them, years of unusually intense monsoon rainfall. Now go back to the flaw in the machine, because this is where it detonates, and it is not the droughts that do it. A hydraulic city can take a drought. That is what the reservoirs are for. Holding water through a shortfall is the entire purpose of the design, and Angkor had more storage than any settlement on Earth. What Angkor could not take was the rain that arrived afterwards, because during a long drought, you do not maintain what you are not using. Channels silt up, embankments go unrepaired, sluices stiffen. Labor that used to be spent clearing the network gets spent on something more urgent. And then the monsoon returns at full strength into a system that has been quietly degrading for a generation, built by 400 years of independent decisions with no margin anywhere in it. You can see what that did. The canal system carries catastrophic sediment loads in this period. Channels are scoured out entirely, cut down below their working level, and then abandoned because they no longer function. The structures where the network met the rivers show damage. And then there is the detail that carries the whole argument, which is what happened next to those structures. They were repaired, reworked, patched, rebuilt where they had failed. But the repairs are cruder than the original construction. Blockwork reused from elsewhere, standards below what the same society had been capable of a century earlier, which tells you 2 things at once, and the second one is the important one. The people were still there, and they were still trying. What they had lost was not the plain and not the will. It was the capacity to build to the standard the machine required. Set that beside where the money was going. Through the 14th century, elite investment drifts south and east, toward the Mekong and the coast, toward the maritime trade with China that was becoming more profitable than anything the inland plain could produce. That is not a court fleeing an enemy. That is a court reallocating. So the shape is starting to appear, a system degrading, a population still present and still working, institutions quietly moving their weight somewhere else, except every single piece of that is inference. Sediment in a ditch tells you a ditch flooded. Crude blockwork tells you somebody rebuilt badly. None of it tells you when precisely, and none of it tells you whether the people at the center of it stayed or went. For an argument built entirely on damage, what you need is a date. Dates do not come out of stonework. They come out of mud. And there was a great deal of mud sitting 400 meters from the temple in a ditch nobody had thought to look at. A moat is a ditch, and a ditch is an archive. Nothing settles at the bottom of standing water without leaving a record of the year it settled in. Pollen from whatever was growing on the banks. Charcoal from whatever was being burned nearby. The remains of the plants that lived in the water itself, layer on layer, in order, undisturbed, for as long as nobody comes along and dredges it. Which at Angkor Wat, it turns out, is the entire question. Dan Penny, working at the University of Sydney, put cores down into the sediment of the Angkor Wat moat and read the column. The results were published in 2019. What that mud records is not an event. It is a withdrawal. Through the 1200s, the signal is what you would expect around the most important religious structure in the empire: land in use, burning nearby, people clearing, cultivating, maintaining. Then, from the early 1300s, those indicators begin to fall away. The pollen of managed land thins, the charcoal thins, and by the middle of that century, the moat itself starts filling with floating aquatic vegetation, which is precisely what a body of standing water does when nobody is clearing it anymore. Put a date on that and the number is difficult to absorb. Maintenance of the moat surrounding the largest religious structure on Earth stops something in the order of a century before the army from the west arrives, which appears to settle the whole thing. The city was already finished. 1431 was a formality performed on a corpse, and the invasion everyone built the story around walked into a place that had given up decades earlier. Except the same cores will not let you say that, because they record something alongside the neglect. Human presence does not vanish from the sequence. Something is still going on around that water while the water is going green. People are still there, doing something, in a landscape whose upkeep has been abandoned. Neglect and occupation in the same layers at the same time. That is a contradiction, and it does not resolve at the bottom of a ditch. There is a second limit, and it is the harder of the two. One core tells you what happened at the point where you put the core in. Penny's own framing of this evidence is gradual decline, deliberately, and not collapse. A decline in the management of one moat is a statement about that moat. Angkor covered something on the order of 1,000 square kilometers. Whether the rest of that plain was doing the same thing at the same time, the mud in this ditch cannot say, and the people who took the cores are careful not to claim that it does. So what you have is a date that contradicts the textbooks, and a signal that contradicts itself. And notice what none of it answers. Everything so far is drawn from what people stopped doing. Stopped clearing the channels, stopped repairing to standard, stopped dredging the moat, stopped carving inscription. Absence measured from a distance, and absence is the easiest thing in archaeology to misread, because it looks identical whether people left or simply changed what they spent their time on. To know which one happened here, coring a ditch is useless. You have to go and dig where these people actually lived and date the ground they lived on directly. For 100 years, nobody did that inside the enclosure, not because it was difficult, because everybody already knew the answer, and there was a low mound sitting in the grass the whole time, waiting for somebody to stop knowing it. So go back to the mound in the grass. It is a few hundred meters inside the western wall of the enclosure, low enough that you could walk over it without registering that the ground had risen, and it is one of a scatter of similar rises laid out in a rough grid across the temple grounds. That grid is the tell. Mounds do not arrange themselves in rows. Somebody put houses on them and raised the ground first because the plain floods. Allison Carter, Miriam Stark, Roland Fletcher, and their colleagues put trenches into those mounds and published the results in 2019. They dated the ground 2 ways. Radiocarbon on the organic material coming out of the occupation layers, and luminescence on the sediment itself, which measures how long a grain of quartz has been buried away from sunlight. 2 independent clocks run against the same soil, and they agree. What the clocks say is that people were living on this ground from around the 11th or 12th century before the temple above them was finished, and that they went on living on it continuously afterwards. Through the 1300s, while the moat 400 meters away was going green, through 1431, and past it. There is no horizon anywhere in these trenches where the occupation stops and something else begins. The enclosure was never abandoned. The event the entire question is organized around did not empty this ground. Whatever happened in 1431, it did not happen to the people who were standing here. Now the case against reading too much into that, because it is real and the excavators make it themselves. This is one enclosure. It is not 1,000 square kilometers, and a temple precinct is the last place in any settlement to empty, because it is the last place people stop having a reason to be. Occupation is also not function. A capital that governs an empire and a place where people continue to live are different things, and only one of them is Angkor at its height. And the court genuinely did leave. It moved south to Longvek and eventually toward the Mekong. The inscriptions genuinely did stop. Something ended here. The disagreement is only ever about what. But look at the shape underneath all three lines of evidence, because the shape survives the objections. The trees record a climate the water network was never built to pass. The mud records a network nobody could keep clearing. The mounds record a population that stayed on the plain while both of those things were happening to it. That is not three findings that fail to agree. That is one process seen from three distances. An empire's institutions and an empire's people are not the same thing, and they do not have to leave together. The court's weight shifted south toward a trade it could still profit from. The machine on the plain degraded past the point where the labor available could hold it, and the people living in the grass beside the temple did what people in that position have always done, which is stay where their land was and go on farming it under a different arrangement. Both of those are true at once, and they always were. Only one of them is visible from outside, and it is the one that got written down, because a court leaving is an event with a date and a population staying is not. So the question itself was built around the wrong word, and the wrong word is not fell. It is suddenly. Go back to the mound one last time. A meter of raised earth in the grass, inside the wall of the largest religious building on earth, with people walking over it all day on their way to photograph something else. Nobody trenched it for a century because the answer had a date on it, and a date was easier to trust than mud. The question was built around an army, because an army can be drawn on a map and a monsoon cannot. Empires are assumed to end the way they are illustrated, at a line, in a year, by a hand. This one did not stop. Its court moved south, its water network failed, its rivers changed course, and the people living in the grass beside the temple stayed exactly where their land was. Angkor was never a story about a city that vanished. It is a story about what we call vanishing, when nobody actually went anywhere.